Margaret of Anjou was the wife of King Henry VI of England. As such, she was Queen of England from 1445 to 1461 and again from 1470 to 1471. Born in the Duchy of Lorraine, into the House of Valois-Anjou, Margaret was the second eldest daughter of René copyright I of Naples and Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine. She was one of the principal figures in the series of dynastic civil wars known as the Wars of the Roses and at times personally led the Lancastrian faction. Due to her husband's frequent bouts of insanity, Margaret ruled the kingdom in his place. It was she who called for a great council in May 1455 that excluded the Yorkist faction headed by Richard, Duke of York, and thus provided the spark that ignited a civil conflict that lasted for over 30 years, decimated the old nobility of England, and caused the deaths of thousands of men, including her only son Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. Margaret was taken prisoner by the victorious Yorkists after the Lancastrian defeat at Tewkesbury. In 1475, she was ransomed by her cousin, King Louis XI of France. She went to live in France as a poor relation of the French king, and she died there at the age of 52. Early life and marriage. Margaret was born on March 23, 1430 at Pont-à-Mousson in the Duchy of Lorraine, an imperial fiefiste of France ruled by a cadet branch of the French kings, the House of Valois-Anjou. Margaret was the second eldest daughter of René copyright of Anjou and of Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine. She had 5 brothers and 4 sisters, as well as 3 half-siblings from her father's relationships with mistresses. Her father, popularly known as Good King René copyright, was Duke of Anjou and titular King of Naples, Sicily and Jerusalem. He has been described as a man of many crowns but no kingdoms. Margaret was baptized at Toul in Lorraine and, in the care of her father's old nurse Théophanie Lamagin, she spent her early years at the castle of Terrasson on the river René in southern France and in the old royal palace at Capua, near Naples in the Kingdom of Sicily. Her mother took care of her education and may have arranged for her to have lessons with the scholar Antoine de La Salle, who taught her brothers. In childhood Margaret was known as La Petite Creature. On April 23, 1445, Margaret married King Henry VI of England, who was 8 years her senior, at Titchfield in Hampshire. Henry at the time also claimed the Kingdom of France and controlled various parts of northern France. Henry's uncle King Charles VII of France, who also claimed the crown of France, agreed to the marriage of Margaret to his rival on the condition that he would not have to provide the customary dowry and instead would receive the lands of Maine and Anjou from the English. The English government, fearing a highly negative reaction, kept this provision secret from the English public. Margaret was crowned Queen Consort of England on May 30, 1445 at Westminster Abbey by John Stafford, Archbishop of Canterbury. She was 15 years old. She was described as beautiful, and furthermore already a woman, passionate and proud and strong-willed. It was felt that she already understood her duty to protect the interests of the crown fervently. She seems to have inherited this indomitability from her mother, who fought to establish her husband's claim to the Kingdom of Naples, and from her paternal grandmother Yolande of Aragon, who actually governed Anjou with a man's hand, putting the province in order and keeping out the English. Thus by family example and her own forceful personality, she was fully capable of becoming the champion of the crown. Birth of a son, Henry, who was more interested in religion and learning than in military matters, was not a successful king. He had reigned since he was only a few months old and his actions had been controlled by regents. When he married Margaret, his mental condition was already unstable and by the birth of their only son, Edward of Westminster, he had suffered a complete breakdown. Rumours were rife that he was incapable of begetting a child and that the new Prince of Wales was the result of an adulterous liaison. Many have speculated that either Edmund Beaufort, 2nd Duke of Somerset, or James Butler, Earl of Wiltshire, both staunch allies of Margaret, was the young prince's actual father. Although Margaret was aggressively partisan and had a volatile temperament, she shared her husband's love of learning by dint of her cultured upbringing and gave her patronage to the founding of Queen's College at Cambridge University. Elizabeth Woodville, later Queen of England as future wife of her husband's rival King Edward IV, allegedly served Margaret of Anjou as a maid of honour. However, the evidence is too scanty to permit historians to establish this with absolute certainty. Several women at Margaret's court bore the name Elizabeth or Isabella Grey. Elizabeth Woodville married her first husband, Sir John Grey of Greby, in about 1452. Beginnings of the dynastic civil wars, enmity between Margaret and the Duke of York. After retiring from London to live in lavish state at Greenwich, Margaret was occupied with the care of her young son and did not display any signs of overt belligerence until she believed her husband was threatened with deposition by the ambitious Richard Plantagenet, 3rd Duke of York, who, to her consternation, had been appointed regent while Henry was mentally incapacitated from 1453 to 1454. The Duke was a credible claimant to the English throne, and by the end of his regency there were many powerful nobles and relatives prepared to back his claim. The Duke of York was powerful. Henry's advisers corrupt. Henry himself trusting, pliable, and increasingly unstable. Margaret defiantly unpopular, grimly and gallantly determined to maintain the English crown for her progeny. Yet at least one scholar identifies the source of the eventual Lancastrian downfall not as York's ambitions nearly so much as Margaret's judging enmity toward York and her overindulgence in unpopular allies. Nevertheless, Queen Margaret was a powerful force in the world of politics. King Henry was putty in her hands when she wanted something done. Margaret's biographer Helen Morra, however, disagrees with earlier historians having dated the much-vaunted enmity between the Queen and York to the time he obtained the office of the Regency. She suggests the mutual antagonism came about 2 years later in 1455 in the wake of the First Battle of St. Albans, when Margaret perceived him as a challenge to the king's authority. Morra bases this conclusion on a judicious study of Margaret's pattern of presenting gifts. This revealed that Margaret took a great deal of care to demonstrate that she favoured both York and Somerset equally in the early 1450s. Morra also claims that Margaret appeared to accept York's regency and asserts there is no substantial evidence to back up the long-standing belief that she was responsible for the Yorkists' exclusion from the Great Council following Henry's recovery. The late historian Paul Murray Kendall, on the other hand, maintained that Margaret's allies Somerset and William de la Pole, then Earl of Suffolk, had no difficulty in persuading her that York, until then one of Henry VI's most trusted advisers, was responsible for her unpopularity and already too powerful to be trusted. Margaret not only convinced Henry to recall York from his post as governor in France and banish him instead to Ireland, she repeatedly attempted to have him assassinated during his travels to and from Ireland, once in 1449 and again in 1450. Somerset and Suffolk's joint responsibility for the secret surrender of Maine in 1448, and then the subsequent disastrous loss of the rest of Normandy in 1449 embroiled Margaret and Henry's court in riots, uprisings by the magnates, and calls for the impeachment and execution of Margaret's two strongest allies. It also might have made an ultimate battle to the death between Margaret and the House of York inevitable by making manifest Richard's dangerous popularity with the Commons. Richard of York, safely returned from Ireland in 1450, confronted Henry and was readmitted as a trusted adviser. Soon thereafter, Henry agreed to convene Parliament to address the calls for reform. When Parliament met, the demands could not have been less acceptable to Margaret. Not only were both Somerset and Suffolk impeached for criminal mismanagement of French affairs and subverting justice, but it was charged as a crime against Suffolk that he had antagonized the king against the Duke of York. Further, the demands for reform put forward included that the Duke of York be acknowledged as the first counsellor to the king, and the Speaker of Commons, perhaps with more fervour than wisdom, even proposed Richard, Duke of York, be recognised as heir to the throne. Within a few months, however, Margaret had regained control of Henry, Parliament was dissolved, the incautious Speaker thrown in prison, and Richard of York retired to Wales for the time being. In 1457, the kingdom was again outraged when it was discovered that Pierre de Bras Tsar Copyright, a powerful French general and an adherent of Margaret, had landed on the English coast and burnt the town of Sandwich. As leader of a French force of 4,000 men from Honfleur, he aimed at taking advantage of the chaos in England. The mayor, John Drury, was killed in this raid. It thereafter became an established tradition, which survives to this day, that the Mayor of Sandwich wears a black robe mourning this ignoble deed. Margaret, in association with Deborah copyright Tsar copyright, became the object of scurrilous rumors and vulgar ballads. Public indignation was so high that Margaret, with great reluctance, was forced to give the Duke of York's kinsman Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, a commission to keep the see for 3 years. He already held the post of Captain of Calais. Leader of Lancastrian faction, hostilities between the rival Yorkist and Lancastrian factions soon fled into armed conflict. In May 1455, just over 5 months after Henry VI recovered from a bout of mental illness and Richard of York's regency had ended, Margaret called for a great council from which the Yorkists were excluded. The council called for an assemblage of the peers at Leicester to protect the king against his enemies. York apparently was prepared for conflict and soon was marching south to meet the Lancastrian army marching north. The Lancastrians suffered a crashing defeat at the First Battle of St. Albans on May 22, 1455. Somerset was killed, Wiltshire fled the battlefield and King Henry was taken prisoner by the victorious Duke of York. In 1459, hostilities resumed at the Battle of Blairheath, where James Touchet, Lord Audley, was defeated by a Yorkist army under Richard Neville, 5th Earl of Salisbury. The Wars of the Roses, military campaigns. While she was attempting to raise further support for the Lancastrian cause in Scotland, her principal commander, Henry Beaufort, 3rd Duke of Somerset, gained a major victory for her at the Battle of Wakefield on December 30, 1460 by defeating the combined armies of the Duke of York and the Earl of Salisbury. Both men were beheaded and their heads displayed on the gates of the city of York. As Margaret was in Scotland at the time the battle had taken place, it was impossible that she issued the orders for their executions despite popular belief to the contrary. She followed up with a victory at the Second Battle of St. Albans on February 17, 1461. In this battle, she defeated the Yorkist forces of Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, and recaptured her husband. It was after this battle that she, in a blatant act of vengeance, ordered the execution of 2 Yorkist prisoners of war, William Bonville, 1st Baron Bonville, and Sir Thomas Kiriel, who had kept watch over King Henry to keep him out of harm's way during the battle. The king had promised the 2 knights immunity, but Margaret gainsaid him and ordered their executions by decapitation. It is alleged that she put the men on trial at which presided her son. "Fair son," she allegedly asked, "what death shall these knights die?" Prince Edward replied that their heads should be cut off, despite the king's pleas for mercy. The Lancastrian army was beaten at the Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461 by the son of the late Duke of York, Edward IV of England, who deposed King Henry and proclaimed himself king. Margaret was determined to win back her son's inheritance and fled with him into Wales and later Scotland. Finding her way to France, she made an ally of her cousin, King Louis XI of France, and at his instigation she allowed an approach from Edward's former supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who had fallen out with his former friend as a result of Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, and was now seeking revenge for the loss of his political influence. Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, was married to Margaret's son Edward, Prince of Wales, in order to cement the alliance, and Margaret insisted that Warwick return to England to prove himself before she followed. He did so, restoring Henry VI briefly to the throne on October 3, 1470. Defeat at Tewkesbury. By the time Margaret, her son and daughter-in-law were ready to follow Warwick back to England, the tables had again turned in favour of the Yorkists, and the Earl was defeated and killed by the returning King Edward IV in the Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471. Margaret was forced to lead her own army at the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, at which the Lancastrian forces were defeated and her 17-year-old son was killed. The circumstances of Edward's death have never been made clear. It is not known whether he was killed in the actual fighting or executed after the battle by the Duke of Clarence. If he died in battle, he would have been the only Prince of Wales ever to do so. Over the previous 10 years, Margaret had gained a reputation for aggression and ruthlessness, but following her defeat at Tewkesbury and the death of her only son, she was completely broken in spirit. After she was taken captive by William Stanley at the end of the battle, Margaret was imprisoned by the order of King Edward. She was sent first to Wallingford Castle and then was transferred to the more secure Tower of London. In 1472 she was placed in the custody of her former lady-in-waiting Alice Chaucer, Duchess of Suffolk, where she remained until ransomed by Louis XI in 1475. Death: Margaret lived in France for the next 7 years as a poor relation of the king. She died in Anjou on August 25, 1482 at the age of 52. She was entombed next to her parents in Angers Cathedral, but her remains were removed and scattered by revolutionaries who ransacked the cathedral during the French Revolution. Margaret's letters: there are many letters extant written by Margaret during her tenure as Queen Consort. One was written to the Corporation of London regarding injuries done to her tenants at the Manor of Enfield, which comprised part of her dower lands. There is another letter which she wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The letters are compiled in a book edited by Cecil Monroe, which was published for the Camden Society in 1863. Margaret typically headed her letters with the words "by the Queen." Ancestors. Depictions in fiction: Margaret is a major character in William Shakespeare's first tetralogy of history plays. Henry VI, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3 and Richard III. Shakespeare portrays Margaret as an intelligent, ruthless woman who easily dominates her husband and fiercely vies for power with her enemies. In Henry VI, Part 2, Margaret has an affair with the Duke of Suffolk and mourns his death by carrying around his severed head. In Henry VI, Part 3, she personally stabs the Duke of York on the battlefield and becomes suicidal when her son Edward is killed in front of her. Despite the fact that Margaret spent the rest of her life outside of England after the death of her husband and son, Shakespeare has her return to the court in Richard III. Margaret serves as a Cassandra-like prophetess. In her first appearance she dramatically curses the majority of the nobles for their roles in the downfall of the House of Lancaster. All of her curses come to pass as the noblemen are betrayed and executed by Richard of Gloucester, and each character reflects on her curse before his execution. Margaret is the title character of Giacomo Mabir's 1820 opera Margaret of Anjou and has an important role in Bulwer Lytton's The Last of the Barons 1843. She is also the subject of Betty King's 1974 biographical novel Margaret of Anjou, Alan Savage's 1994 novel Queen of Lions, Anne Power's historical romance The Royal Consorts, and Susan Higginbottom's 2011 novel The Queen of Last Hopes. Sharon K. Penman's novel The Sun in Splendor features her as an important character in the early parts of the book, up until the Battle of Tewkesbury. Jean Play's The Red Rose of Anjou also features her. She also is the subject of a fictional biography, The Royal Tigress by a fictional character, David Powlett-Jones, who is the main subject of To Serve Them All My Days, R.F. Delderfield's novel of a Welsh schoolmaster at a Devon public school from World War I to the Battle of Britain in the 40s. Delderfield, in the person of Powlett-Jones, appears to have a very good grasp of Margaret's life and the Wars of the Roses, and the content and development of the book give us an entertaining subplot to the book's main narrative. Margaret is also a major character in The Lady of the Rivers, a novel by Philippa Gregory. She is the main force in the life of Jacquetta, the wife of Richard Woodville. In the television series The White Queen, based on Gregory's novels The Cousins' War, Margaret of Anjou is portrayed by Veal Baetons. It has been suggested that Cersei Lannister, a major character in George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, is modeled on Margaret. Notes, footnotes. Citations. References: Abbott, Jacob. History of Margaret of Anjou, Queen of Henry VI of England. Reproduction of 1871 text by Kessinger Presser, Bagley, J. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England. Herbert Jenkins A. Brooke, CNL. Ortenberg, v. The Birth of Margaret of Anjou. Historical Research 14, 357 a Euro 58 a, Boutel, Charles. A Manual of Heraldry, Historical and Popular. Windsor and Newton A., Cockayne, George Edward, ed. Complete Peerage of England, Scotland, Ireland, Great Britain and the United Kingdom, extant, extinct or dormant 5. London, George Bell and Sons A., Costain, Thomas B. The Last Plantagenets. Popular Library, New Yorker, Fraser, Antonia. The Lives of the Kings and Queens of England. University of California Press. Hay, Philip. The Military Campaigns of the Wars of the Roses. Allen Sutton Publishing Limited. ISBN A978-0-938289-90-6. Hookham, Mary Ann. The Life and Times of Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England and France. Kendall, Paul Murray. Richard III. George Allen and Unwin. ISBN A0-04-942048-8. Mora, Helen E. Margaret of Anjou, Queenship and Power in Late Medieval England. Boydell Press. Wagner, J. A. Encyclopedia of the Wars of the Roses. Santa Barbara. ISBN A1-85109-358-3. Weir, Alison. Lancaster and York, The Wars of the Roses. Pimlico. ISBN A0-7126-6674-5A.